This is our first panel of the day, and we're super excited. I mean, we've got some rock stars up here. So what I'd like you to do, each individually, is just give a little overview of who you are and what you do in a couple of sentences, and then we'll get into our conversation.
Thank you, Beth. So my name is Jessica Grove-Smith. I am from the Passive House Institute. I'm from a scientific background. Doing research work there, but also part of the joint management team for 14 years, and really excited about being part of the team advancing the standard and the quality assurance processes.
Hi, good morning, everyone. My name is Alea German. I'm an engineer with Frontier Energy. I work out of California. I live in Colorado. And I lead our residential California code development and code consulting, where we work with the state to recommend code change proposals and drive high-performance buildings, and also work with jurisdictions to drive it at the local level.
My name is Paul Ormond. I work for the Commonwealth of Massachusetts in the Department of Energy Resources. The DOER is the State Energy Office. One of our mandates is building codes. So my role at the DOER is interacting with building codes and helping advance those, and advancing the state's legislative mandates for decarbonization of our economy.
Morning, everyone. My name is Brad Mahoney with Millennium Partners in Boston. I lead our sustainable development practices, healthy building practices, and also work on the overall development and construction, specifically over at Winthrop Center. Many of you will be touring tomorrow. I'll be on the tour, excited to have you there. Real quickly, my background, degree in mechanical engineering. I spent 15 years working for a construction manager before joining Millennium 10 years ago.
Thank you, everyone. So the perfect group to engage in a conversation about efficiency. So let's go deep. Jessica, let's start with you. Craig introduced PHI, or Passive House, as the groups and the people that drive efficiency. So as we kind of click that deeper into high-performing buildings, kind of level set us on the importance of efficiency and the things that come with that in pursuing Passive House.
Yeah, thank you, Beth. So as Craig was saying, it's really the international community, it's every individual that drives the change. I think what's really important of this, that you have a good backbone that you can lean on, a good standard that you can trust, that you know that works. And that's where Passive House has a really great history and has been around for a while. It was developed initially as a research project. Wolfgang Feist with a vision to say, I want to make a change. He tried it out with a first pilot project, it worked, and then he took it from there. And I think that's what really distinguishes Passive House from many other standards that are out there, that it has the scientific background, it has the research background, and then it takes it step for step, and implementing it in a way with quality assurance processes along the way. So the idea that Passive House as such has a clear target, a clear idea of what it's set out to do. It's focused on this aspect of operational energy, knowing that that is where buildings have a lot of emissions and cause a lot of climate damage, and that's where we can really tackle and make a difference. Passive House has focused on that area, provided a solution for that specific section, and it's done that in a very robust way. It's been very persistent over these many, many, many years. It focuses on that, it does that great, that's why we're all kind of on board and keep doing it and scaling it. But at the same time, it's always been open to kind of synergies and other things to chip in. So for me, I also joined Passive House 14 years ago because of climate change, because I was so impressed by the change that we can make. But it's been fascinating to be on this journey, see Passive House develop, see the community grow, and speak to people and say that people see how people are coming to this from very, very different angles. That it's not only about energy efficiency, it's also about comfort, it's about health, it's about being able to afford your energy bills. So there's so much that feeds into this whole topic of energy efficiency. So I think this whole standard, this whole quality assurance process has been great in driving, but there's a lot more that feeds into this.
That's great. You know, Bronwyn once said, and I copy her a lot, that Dr. Feist's vision for Passive House was as much about hygienic ventilation as it was efficiency. Can you comment a little bit about the genesis of the standard and his views?
Yeah, so the vision was definitely energy efficiency, but it was about building better buildings. So doing it in a way that you achieve energy savings, but you're not compromising in any way the way that people live. We spend a lot of time indoors, so the vision was always about having a space that is healthy, that is comfortable. That's the focus. We need good buildings, but how can we do that in a way that they have a small carbon footprint? That was the vision, and that's what I think it's really impressive how Wolfgang Feist managed to develop the concept.
Right, before a pandemic.
Before the pandemic, yeah.
So, Alea, take that a step further in terms of efficiency and how you do your work to drive efficiency. And as you've done your work, especially some of the testing and modeling and simulation work that you do with the various entities, how does Passive House fit with efficiency in that regard?
Well, I think, the theme that you brought up, Jessica, that so much is interconnected and kind of this idea that efficiency is more important now than ever as we have these really aggressive decarbonization goals. And in California, as you guys are all here, I've learned some great lessons so far about what's going on in Massachusetts and New York. But, we're struggling to figure out what is the best solution in each of our markets to achieve these really deeply efficient buildings and drive decarbonization. And we know electrification is a big piece of that, but part and parcel with electrification is efficiency. And so that's why I think Passive House, there's this really big opportunity to kind of combine these desires and a lot of policymakers that we have on board now to move forward with these policies, which are looking at how do we decarbonize our existing buildings, our new buildings, and incorporate efficiency and market that along with all of the other benefits that our high performance buildings bring. The California Energy Commission did a study recently of what the demand is going to be to address electrification of buildings, and it was some big number. And then they said, well, if we incorporate efficiency with that, we can reduce that by 20%. And of course, that didn't consider Passive House, and as you all know, the opportunity is much greater than 20%, right? We can drive that down so much deeper than 20%. So one of the near-term goals that I have is figuring out how we can incorporate some of our principles and strategies that Passive House has brought us into code. So appropriate levels of insulation, infiltration, best envelope practices. How can we incorporate that into codes for the broader building base so that the spread is so much bigger than just Passive House certified buildings?
So, Paul, we heard a little earlier today that Massachusetts is making some great strides on efficiency. So what do you think is responsible for that? I mean, outside of these really great people here, of course, but outside of the really great people, what do you think is responsible for driving that type of performance? Because it's impressive.
Yeah, thank you. So with Massachusetts, we have a legislative mandate to reduce our carbon emissions of our whole economy by 2050, and there's interim goals along the way too that are also legislatively mandated. So we have a GHG reduction not goal. It's not a GHG reduction aspiration. It's required by law, and that was when that was put in place, and then several interim other pieces of legislation also put in place to put more structure around that. That really shaped everything, and from that, filters into the incentive programs we have at Mass Save. That filters into our building code, and then of course when we do the math for what our building code should look like, what you discover is that Passive House is it's not just energy efficiency. there's really two more dimensions to it that is critical for building decarbonization. The first one is, inside the passive house requirements are limits on thermal energy demand intensity for space heating. And that means that we're making, when you look at those reductions, they are huge. The thermal energy demand intensity reduction for space heating is typically in the 70 to 90%. And what that means is that when we build with passive house standards or use those kind of design techniques, we are crushing space heating. And that means that we can more easily electrify. So that's one of the two things that passive house does for us in terms of decarbonization on top of the energy efficiency. The other thing is related to reducing the demand of the building itself at any given time. So we can't just take our current buildings and take out the gas and put in heat pumps and expect that to work. We have to actually reduce the electric loads too, so we don't create another, a peak load situation that our grid can't handle. So passive house and design techniques that are like passive house deliver those two things.
So when the legislation hit, I'm sure there was a fair amount of grousing from people who might not have known how to get there or how to achieve that. But there's an innovation curve, a typical innovation curve, right, where you get early adopters and then you break through that and you get more mainstream. So where do you think this community is in terms of that adoption curve?
So I would say that we're definitely on the part of the curve that starts to go into scale. If you see like the hockey stick graph kind of thing. So I don't know the exact date. It was somewhere maybe either 5 or 7 years ago. We had one passive house single family home in Massachusetts. One. That was either 5 years ago or 7 years ago. Either way, that was not that long ago to have a single passive house building in Massachusetts. It was a single family home. And now we have, I don't know the statistics, but it's in the order of 15 or 20,000 dwelling units to be built to passive house, either being built or in the queue. So I think that we have already gone past the learning curve for new construction. Okay, I think we still have a lot of learning curve in retrofits, but for new construction, we are now in the how do we scale this as fast as possible part of that curve.
Thank you. We're going to drill deeper on the retrofit, repeat. We'll drill a little deeper on that a little later. I want to jump, Brad, to you and MP Boston and Winthrop Center. And first of all, congratulations to you all on that first ever Visionary Award. Super impressive. Before we get into the project itself, give us just a flavor for what the award means and how do you feel about it personally? How does MP Boston look at that in terms of impact?
Thank you, Beth. And I think hearing everyone today, John Delzell, Hank Keating, Paul, Jessica, it really puts to light all the hard work that this community, the city of Boston, state of Massachusetts, Germany, Passive House Network, that we collectively have been working on. What Paul just said 7 years ago, one Passive House certified residential building. Well, it was 7 years ago that the city of Boston put out an RFP that is ultimately what we're developing right now. And the decision to go Passive House was finalized, shortly thereafter. It was, we're going in on this. And it was brought to us by Handel, who's on our team, with Stephen Winters, right? The Passive House gurus in my mind. And so it's a tremendous honor. And what we wanted to do was really kind of bring this innovation to help spur on a new way of developing large-scale office buildings because, we didn't see the future, but we just said, look, it feels like this is where the world is going. And we want a building for the long term, kind of change the paradigm a little bit about how development could be brought forward. So it's a tremendous honor. Really grateful to the partnership at Millennium Partners for saying, look, we want to do this, let's go out and let's try it. And so thank you.
Right, that's no small task, right? It has to be led from the top, and that might be one of the reasons why smaller companies are quicker to adopt and grab new concepts, and the larger ones are a little bit slower. But MP Boston showed a lot of tenacity and commitment to take that step and then represent for everybody else how to do it. So talk a little bit about the project. And what are people going to see when they tour, and what are the key qualities and attributes of the project that you're most proud of?
Yeah, so before I dive in real quick on that, what Beth just mentioned is kind of from the top. The president of the company, worked with me, and we did extensive research. We did, created a digital library about everything that we were doing. Came up to our Boston team and said, we had a meeting, and we said, look, this is the way forward, right? By heart, right? We hadn't necessarily developed a lot of high-performance buildings. This is what we're going to do, right? This is Winthrop Center, and we are all on board with this, right? So it became this idea of, okay, passive house, integration with, healthy buildings, right? A passive house building is a healthy building, right? And so when we go on the tour tomorrow, number one, the architecture itself, it's just a beautiful building. And that's kind of, for us, that's the starting point, right? And what we've learned through the years is kind of integrating passive house, high performance, healthy building. How do we talk about that, right? And it's kind of informed our way of thinking and everything that we integrated into the project, right? This idea of, kind of creating a large-scale commercial office that meets the city's goals, the state's goals, and kind of provide a roadmap for other projects to understand how to meet those decarbonization goals and how tenants can embrace that.
So speaking of tenants, what's been the response? So as you go out and you talk to people about what this means, how have they responded to you all in terms of understanding? Do they get it? Do you have to teach? Do you have to educate?
I think that answer has evolved over the years. I mean, when we first got permitted back in 2018, our instinct was we're leading with passive house, right? We're leading with passive house. We went over to Germany, we met with Jessica, Corinna, Zeno, the entire team. That was 2018. We showed a video last night, 2018. That was 4 years ago. We came back, and after meeting with some very, very large-scale tenants, one of the tenants asked, well, why would we want to be the first in a passive house building, right? And so we realized that messaging was key. You go through the pandemic, healthy buildings at the forefront of everyone's mind, right? Technology, commercial real estate industry has undergone a transformational change over the past 2.5 years because of the pandemic. And what I would say is over the past 8 to 12 months, we have seen such interest in this idea of a high-performing, low-carbon building because companies realize that it's good business. It's good business, and it's because they're trying to attract and retain top talent because like all of us in here, right, our lives, our kids' lives depend on that, right? So if you want to directly embrace your workforce, and for us, our customer is our office tenant, right? Resident, whoever your customer is, targeting that message directly to them. And we've seen tremendous, partnership, Cambridge Associates, IR&M, we're working on another tenant right now. So I think it's promising.
That's great. Paul, so we talked about the experience curve, the innovation curve, and getting people to climb up that curve and jump on board, right? Get on the train. So what role does Winthrop Center play in getting people to commit to getting on that bandwagon?
When Winthrop Center came to see us and explained what they were doing, it was just awesome because anything that we can do to share with others, and I always joke that I use a lot of guilt and shame in my work, to say, look what they're doing. Can you do it too? It can be done. And, I mean, for developers, I think that we kind of joke like it's all about money or something like that, but it's actually a little different than that, I think, for developers. It's really about risk. So anytime that we have an example project that we can point to say, it's been done, it's being done, talk to these folks. We have another project, the distillery in Boston, that was an awesome launch pad for lots of passive house in Massachusetts, because it was like, this can be done. You can go call the developer. He lives there. He might be in this room somewhere. And tour the building, and you can see how nice it is. So, similar kind of thing with visits to your building. Anything that can be an example to show that this is not as risky as you may think, go ahead and give it a shot. That was huge for us. Yeah.
That's great. So, Alea, they were talking about evidence, and Winthrop Center stands as evidence of what can be done. In your world, how do you use evidence to convince code authorities or legislators, regulators to believe in what's possible in terms of efficiency?
Yeah, well, it's probably one of the most critical pieces to be able to get widespread buy-in and acceptance for something that's different, right? And so having these examples out there that and this is one of a kind, very impressive, and we have many more across the world. Jessica showed us some earlier, and all of that helps develop this kind of collective data that we have to inform kind of the benefits of high performance buildings. It helps to develop best practices and lessons learned. And all of that is really important for that acceptance, for that broader acceptance, to be able to demonstrate that hey, this is something that we know how to do. There's proven strategies to do it, and not only does it help us with our climate change goals, but it also we have demonstrated improvement in indoor air quality, comfort, et cetera, all that kind of stuff. I think that it doesn't just happen through including passive house as part of a policy directly. It happens through, like I was mentioning earlier, incorporating those design strategies that have been developed through passive house into codes. It happens through workforce training, where you have somebody that took a passive house training and has been exposed to that, went on a tour, and they're working alongside somebody who hasn't in a building that's not a passive house building, and they're teaching them something. They're providing that background and experience. So I think there's a lot of little ways that the high performance buildings, as we all really embrace it, it helps to enable it more broadly.
Have you seen an attitudinal shift? It seems like, at least on the East Coast, we're seeing code officials and regulators, even legislators to a certain degree, more open to having the conversation about what's possible and how to embed some of those metrics into future codes. Do you see an attitudinal shift in the people that you're dealing with?
Yes and no. What we're seeing in California right now is a hyper focus on electrification. And a lot of people are still interested in that efficiency conversation, but unfortunately, I feel like we've taken a little bit of a step back and we've lost some people's interest in those other metrics. And so that's why it's now, as I said before, more than ever, the efficiency piece is really important to drive home and continue selling that message that to meet these decarbonization goals, we need to think of all these things cohesively as a package, not just one thing, not just grid reliability, not just resilience, not just comfort, not just electrification, not just efficiency, all those things together.
So Paul, that's a great, I think, pivot to you, back to you talked about decarbonization, and how do you see the relationship? How hard is it, or how focused do you have to be to keep efficiency tied to this notion of decarbonization?
Yeah, so I just want to echo that we're seeing the same trend in Massachusetts. So even where we have made great progress in passive house and efficiency in the state, I'm actually starting to pick up in the last year or so a lot of messaging that, hey, I electrified my building, I'm done. And that is, we have to be very cautious about that because, as I said, we actually need those few things that passive house delivers, the energy efficiency, but the other two things is the, crushing of that heating load. We have to make that extremely small, and we have to make those the demands on the electric grid extremely small as well. If we only electrify, that would be problematic.
Right, I mean, no doubt. So, Jessica, I want to come back to you to comment on that, and then I want to stay with you and click a little bit deeper on passive house. But in general, based on what Paul and Alea were saying, do you see the same things in other parts of the world?
Very similar discussions, yeah. I think the nuances are always difficult or different in different parts of the world just because the societal and the political context is very different. So the kind of the way people approach it or the reasons for getting to this point are very different. But yes, everybody is in this area of we need to decarbonize, and we do it very, very quickly. And then there's the topic of electrification. So those are really the two big topics, the two big drivers at the moment. And we have the same dilemma, the same things happening in other countries where there's a lot of push for electrification. Fine, we'll just switch to heat pump and that solves it. Or there's the discussion about we just add PV and that's me done. I'm now solving my problem by putting PV in. There's nothing wrong, it's good. We need the renewable energies, that's part of the story. But I think people are only just starting to catch on and realize that scaling those sustainable solutions, scaling a full renewable energy supply is only going to work if we have energy efficiency as a basis of everything. So very similar discussions in other parts of the world.
So when we think about existing buildings, you guys now have a certified hospital. We think about different building types, and existing buildings still stand as kind of the biggest test, the place where we haven't made as many big strides. We're still a little earlier on that adoption curve, right? So when you think about that and this notion of efficiency, decarbonization, electrification, only made that much more complex in an existing building and in trying to get an existing building to zero carbon, zero energy, et cetera, healthy building, et cetera. How do you think about driving that agenda that you talked about earlier when you were in front of the group?
Very good question and a very hard question. I wish I had the answer.
That's why you got it. You got the hard question.
I'll pass it on to you for your thoughts
She
after.
wants to send it down the line.
Maybe you guys have got a brilliant idea of how to approach this. I think we need to maybe take a step back in a way and not scare people too much and say, okay, this is what you've got to do. You've got to do it absolutely perfectly right all in one go. And then people get a bit of a panic because they get overwhelmed and then they'd rather not do anything, or they'll just do a tiny little bit. That's the easiest and the kind of the lowest barrier. So talk through it. Raise awareness of what the important aspects are. That's partly what we're doing as part of this Efficiency Now campaign that I mentioned earlier, trying to really pick people up where they are and raising awareness on what the important aspects are. So if you have a single family house, you could be completely overwhelmed. You want to do something, but you don't know where to start. Do I have to start with changing my heating system, or is it better to start with the envelope? And to be honest, they affect each other, and there's not one right solution that's going to fit every single building. We need the envelope, so it doesn't make sense just to switch to all electric without thinking ahead. We need that efficiency level. But I think you need to look at your individual building and say, okay, let's take it step at a time. If my windows are at the end of their lifetime and I'm going to replace them, the really important aspect, and that's what we need to bring across to people, if you're only looking at windows right now, then make sure you do that little bit properly and do that well right now. Then you've achieved something, you've avoided lock-in effect over the lifetime, of that building for the energy. And then when you're ready to take the next step, you take the next step. So that's something that we're trying to get to people and communicate more. And that's part of the retrofit plan that we've also developed and are offering people. So I think it's really picking up people where they are, taking away some of that overwhelming worry of where do I start? Yeah.
That's a great point. And there was a webinar, I'll give a plug out to a webinar from last week, from last Friday, that one of the folks from your team, Wolfgang Hasper, right? We were talking about biolabs and the challenges of life science type buildings. And he made the comment, which I thought was so profound, that the envelope is enduring, it's lasting, and it changes, it stays while use changes. Use may change over the life of a building, but the envelope doesn't. And so when you think about the incremental cost of dealing with that envelope, that's almost where we have to start in terms of our mindset, right? And so, Paul, I want to switch to you, because it feels to me like when it comes to existing buildings, we're almost bringing the curve back to that early adopter. And as you think about policy, do the laws apply to the existing buildings? Do you see adoption? Do you see more people being willing to jump in on existing buildings to drive efficiency?
I think we have a lot of work to do on existing buildings. We're way over on the left side of those curves. There's still a long, flat area to go through first before we scale. I think what Jessica was saying is very true. We need to develop an array of existing building solutions that meet the building and the building owner's needs where they are, to make sure that when the opportunities come up, we have a ready-made retrofit solution for them that makes sense for what that building is doing at that time. So for example, if someone is doing a gut renovation, that's an awesome time to do an EnerFit kind of thing. But if someone is just remodeling their kitchen, what do we do then? How can we come up with a building code and an array of solutions that works for where that building is then? And right now, our building codes, our practices, I don't think have that, and people are sort of scratching their heads. So I would say all of us need to start working on that, and we need your help for sure here at the state in developing solutions for that situation.
So Brad, can we challenge MP Boston to find an existing building and drive it to Passive House? Can we entice you into this conversation?
Well, I think, Beth, we're about to find out how in the city of Boston, how existing buildings are addressed thanks to the decarbonization legislation that was passed, BERDO 2.0, which I think is going to spur on some inevitable innovation, right? And I had a discussion about this recently. Okay, so to that point, right, it seems overwhelming to a developer, an owner, whether you're institutional, whether you're a sole proprietor, right? And maybe it's a series of case studies that says, look, you apply these three things and it gets you to point A, point B, point C, right? And if you apply the EnerFit standard, right, what does that mean? How much money does the owner have to put out versus on the backside, if it's a high-rise building that's a single pane, facade, which we have those in Boston, right? What is the payback? So I think we're about to find out, at least in the city, and that maybe some of that can be used elsewhere based on, that legislation alone. But it's all that collective action.
Yeah, that's helpful. So let me go to you and stay with you on this notion of finances, because you brought up the idea of payback, and I don't want to miss the chance to talk about return on investment, right? So how does MP Boston think about that? When the CEO came and said, we're going to do this, I'm sure people were like, oh my God, it's going to cost a fortune. So how do you feel about it today? How do you feel about the cost of Passive House, the return on investment, and how would you talk to somebody else considering a tower, a commercial tower, the way you guys are looked at Winthrop Center?
Right. So the story kind of starts back when we were first going through this. There was an event at the Mass Building Congress where people were talking about passive house. What are the passive house premiums? And this is way back when, and the construction manager said, well, the premiums we saw were between 6 and 10%. You know, I nearly like swallowed my tongue because kind of coming from the construction manager's world, I was like, I don't quite believe that, but that's what they're saying. So then owners start believing that, and it becomes a perception, right? And perception becomes reality within our world. Sitting here today, right? So 4 years ago, I would have said between 2 and 3% is the cost premium, the initial cost premium on the overall hard cost for the passive house portion. Today, that number is going down for a number of different reasons. Paul's work, right? The state energy code, right? Effectively now, the triple glazed windows that we're putting in to crush the heating load along with the other passive house elements, triple glazed windows are effectively business as usual, right? So then as that number in the industry starts becoming more and more aware, supply chains start opening up. Those on the tour, you'll see the energy recovery units that we have to put in to, you know, satisfy 800,000 square feet of office. As those manufacturers start developing that, that cost premium gets flattened. And in terms of the overall return on investment, you know, I think it's all about talking to the owner about what's your model, right? Are you a long-term hold, right? If you're a long-term hold, I mean, this is a no-brainer, an absolute no-brainer, because we went into this not necessarily knowing if we would get higher rents day one, but if you look at it long-term, you know, look at how ESG has kind of become at the forefront of how companies view their investments. Well, here we go, right? This is it. This hits a chord.
Well, and you had a very experienced team, right, between Handel and Stephen Winter. And the experience curve, so Pennsylvania Housing Finance Agency did some work that said a team with experience can come in with much flatter costs than teams without experience. And you had a very experienced team. Do you think you saw that in terms of the impact?
That definitely helps, but it always is about, you know, the 70% of the overall development cost, the construction manager, right, and the trades, and the understanding of what are the cost elements, right? Having the experienced designers is one thing, but being able to break down, okay, we're going to aero seal the ductwork, right? So what are the impacts there? Maybe $250,000, an adjustment to the schedule, right? The facade, the $5 to $10 a square foot impact on the facade, right? Now that's coming down because we talked about business as usual. It's really breaking it down into its elements and simplifying it for, you know, the men and women on the project, the project managers that are, you know, buying out the actual, you know, passive house elements, integrating it into the design in a way that this is just the project.
Jessica, do you see the same thing? You were shaking your head when we were talking about the experience of teams and the importance of that.
Yeah, I'm trying to sort my thoughts. There are so many things that resonated here. I thought, yes, we see the same in other parts of the world. I think there are different drivers to cost, but when it comes to kind of cost premium of an energy efficient buildings, then it's definitely two things that I think are really, really important, and you mentioned both of them. One is the availability of components. So that's just market transformation. We need those components to be available, and we need them to be available at an affordable or at affordable prices. So working collectively at building that market is something that's midterm, long-term going to drive down costs. So that's something really, really important. And for that, I think it's important for the market to know where we're heading. So for policy, again, to show this is the direction we're heading in, give security to the market, give security to the manufacturers to invest in better products. So I think that's one really important part of it, components. The other one that you just mentioned, you also mentioned, Brad, is the learning. So having teams on board that know what they're doing, that had experiences before, know which aspects it is that maybe you can optimize the design. So even if you have a component that's slightly more expensive, you adjust the design in a way that you save costs somewhere else. So I think that learning curve is really, really important. That is certainly something that we've seen in different parts of the world. So passive house, where passive house or high energy efficiency building is more established, the costs go down and we come out at a cost parity. So studies on cost are always, the outcome is a bit random, right? You get reports where you say the additional investment cost is 10% or even more, and you get others that publish reports that say, actually, on average, my high performance buildings was exactly the same or even cheaper. That we also have reports that see that. So a part of this discussion that I always find difficult on cost is we focus so much about what is this additional cost for high performance building, but I think we need to also see and put that into context of overall costs of construction. So many other decisions that are being made in the context of building, in the context of whether it's your material choices, whether it's the standard, so many cost decisions that go into construction. That these percentages are so small in comparison of the overall that I think we need to put this in perspective. And the situation that we're in with the climate crisis, it should be a no-brainer to say, if I have to choose between having a slightly more fancy fit out, or I'm putting that extra money into something that is resilient, that is protecting the future, it should be a no-brainer where you're putting that money. And I'd love to see the discussion go in that direction. I feel myself getting a bit frustrating and losing the patience with the discussion on, oh, but the premium, the extra cost. So maybe we can move the discussion in a bit different way.
Right, so Brad mentioned for long-term holders that there's a return, that it's a no-brainer. Do you see that? And because there are buildings around the world that, larger towers that may have been around for a longer period. Do you see the value of those buildings increase versus their competition? How do developers, long-term holders of buildings think about it in other parts of the world?
I don't think I have enough statistics really to give you a fundamental answer. And I mean, as much as I'd like to say that's what we're seeing, I don't want to just put something out here that I don't have the evidence for. But yes, we have seen individual municipalities, Exeter, for example, in the UK, they've been very active and they say, look, the passive house projects that we've built, yes, they are more popular and they do have a higher values. So we are starting to get that feedback that properties that have been built to higher energy efficiency and have gone through the certification, have gone through that quality assurance process, have higher value.
Exeter's a great example, right? It's got a lot of corollary to Boston in many regards in terms of how they started, how they put their priorities and principles in place, their codes and their requirements and regulations.
Yeah, and how they're pioneering. So they're the ones who built the very first passive house leisure centre in the UK. They said, oh, this has been done once or twice, so let's try it out in the UK context, and they've gone ahead and done it. And that kind of project has really created a ripple effect. So there's one in the UK, now completed, now open, and suddenly we're getting requests from all over the country saying, oh, if it's been done once, we can do it again. So I'm hoping that's also what we'll see as effect of Winthrop Centre.
Yeah, that's right. So, Alea, you and I had a conversation once about the importance of data and evidence. And I think what we're seeing is that the more data and evidence that we have, the more we're able to influence policyholders and developers and people who want to spend the money, but they want to reduce their risk. They want to reduce financial risk. How would you talk to somebody about risks and the data and evidence that you've seen? How would you convince somebody to say, that's probably a good idea to try passive house?
Yeah,
Paul, the question's coming to you then after that, Paul, the question.
Be prepared. Yeah, there was a lot of good things said recently, Brad and Jessica, related to this topic, and we have today a lot of the data to demonstrate this, right? To help make the case to individuals, to investors, to policymakers that it makes sense. We're still really handcuffed, back to your point about how we qualify cost effectiveness and return on investment. we're really kind of handcuffed to this idea of it has to pencil out. And yes, so much is driven by money. We can't put that aside. We can't forget that. But there's so much, what is it, the chicken or the egg, what came first? We need that market transformation to be able to drive the cost of those triple pane windows down. And then all of a sudden it makes a lot more sense, and it's the technologies out there. We can manufacture them at an affordable cost or a cost-effective cost, but we need to have the demand. And then we also have, I think we're all kind of collectively as policymakers, we're getting more creative about how we can incorporate costs that we typically haven't included in our cost effectiveness equation, the cost of carbon, and then there's more challenging things, the cost of comfort, the cost of health, all these things, but we're now thinking about that, and we're now incorporating some of those metrics in various ways into how we value cost effectiveness. And that's really important from a policy perspective, and I think we need to keep moving in that direction to be able to make this case in new and better ways to more people as we're coming upon this climate crisis.
Go ahead, Paul, same question to you.
Yeah, so we're always out there constantly looking for experiences, case studies, publications that show results that we can share with our leadership. My job is basically a researcher, and I just bring our leadership that research. And so we have, so Pennsylvania has instituted a passive house points in their affordable housing RFQ process some years ago, and someone kept track of the cost per square foot of all the resulting bids that came in over a 3 or 4 year period. So we got that data. And what that shows is that there was something like 130 projects were done in that period, and 60 of them were passive house, and the others weren't. And what it shows is that there's actually really no correlation between cost and whether there was passive house or not. It just looks like a big giant scatter plot. And so when we presented this to our leadership, we just said, doesn't really seem to really matter that much. It's not like the dots that are red that are passive house are up here on the graph, and then the other dots are down here on the graph. What mattered was that someone chose better doorknobs on this project, and this other project might have done different finishes, and this other project has a bigger kitchen. So those things, so what you can say then is maybe the premium costs of passive house are just another line item on a long list of line items. And so when you aggregate them all, you get a scatter plot. If you do actually average all the costs, you find another interesting piece of data. One was that the average cost of the non-passive house projects were a few dollars less per square foot than the passive house projects during year 1. And then in year 2, that went a little smaller. And then in year 3, it flipped. So that was another data point that we presented to our...
It flipped that the passive house projects were slightly less expensive, than the traditional approach to, yeah, that's right.
So again, we presented this to our leadership and said, so it just doesn't seem like there's a big correlation there. So what we should look at then is our state decarbonization goals. So, we look at the cost data and we say, not a lot of correlation. But when we look at performance data, and you can find tons of reports that measure passive house, there's an excellent study of a multifamily project that was built to lead whatever, and then the same exact project 2 years later built, in every possible respect was the same to passive house, and both were monitored for many years. And you can clearly see that the passive house performs way better. So I just turned that into carbon just do the math and show that, gee, there's not a lot of correlation with costs, but there's a huge correlation with carbon emissions. So leadership, pay attention to Passive House, because we see based on data that it can really help us achieve our legislative mandates and not seemingly going to break the bank when it comes to cost. So that's a good example of using data.
That's great. So speaking of data, Brad, at Winthrop Center, will you guys be continuously monitoring energy, indoor air quality? How do you guys think about that? And then further to that, are there any plans for either you all or your team to put together the case study that Paul was talking about to try and continue to get the information out to people?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, it's been part of our conversation with our tenants, right? When we go out there and we say that, the existing Class A building uses 150% more energy than Winthrop Center, there's a discussion. Well, we want to understand that, right? And so it's incumbent upon us, the metering scheme and everything that we're putting into the building, to be able to prove that out, because as part of our sustainability practices within our leases, we want the tenants to fully understand on a day-by-day basis where they stand, right? If they have a good idea about how to positively impact, the outcome in the building, we want them to share that with us, and vice versa. And indoor air quality, 100%. I mean, we have indoor air quality monitors and sensors that are going to be displaying real time within some of the public spaces, encouraging our tenants within, the guidelines to kind of engage in not only high performance but healthy building practices. And this overlap between healthy and high performance is kind of a key talking point. Right? Passive House is a comfort standard, directly addresses the climate crisis, decarbonization, but it's a healthy building, right? And when you boil it down to those key elements, tenants instantly understand and grasp and want to, be part of that.
Did you all have to think differently about your leasing? So did you think about leases, the idea of a green lease? I know there are a lot of organizations out there putting out information on the different components of a green lease to try and ensure that tenants are compliant and understand what's involved in managing the building.
Yeah, 100%. And part of that is driven by, policy, right? So Berto 2.0, right? We want to understand if someone is kind of using a little bit too much energy, right? You don't want others to be paying the penalty. That's a practical consideration. But also this idea of what I was just talking about, kind of mutual sustainability practices that are embedded within the leases themselves, that allow tenants to kind of understand exactly what we're doing at every step of the way. Is the facade doing what you claim it was going to be doing? Crushing the heating goals. I love that, by the way, because it captures the essence of what Passive House is doing in a cold climate.
Right, so with your monitoring, you'll know immediately if anybody's Bitcoin mining.
Yes, well, hopefully we know that before then, but yes.
That's great. So Jessica, let's come back to you. Let's click a little bit deeper on, just for people who are kind of new joining us and trying to get their appetite for Passive House, trying to understand what it is. Let's go kind of back to basics. And with the approach of Passive House, what type of building will it yield? What are all of the benefits of Passive House done well and done right?
Okay, well, I'll get started, and I'll invite you guys to add to the list.
That's a group
maybe
discussion, so anybody jump in.
Yeah, okay. Benefits of Passive House. Okay, I think we're going to hearing a lot about it throughout the day today. That's a lot what this conference and today is about. I could come out just with keywords. I don't know how you want to take this, whether we... Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, or I can prompt you, like,
Yeah.
How about air quality?
Yeah.
Healthy or unhealthy?
I don't know.
Healthy.
Very, very healthy. So definitely air quality has been part of it from day one. Brings us back to the discussion when we started this panel. It's about having good, healthy buildings. So actually, in the early days of Passive House, especially in the context of Germany, ventilation is not part of traditional buildings. It's not part of old buildings. It's even today, new builds often don't have any kind of ventilation system. Whereas in a Passive House, it's clear, no, we need a good indoor environment. There's only point in building a building if you have a good, comfortable, healthy indoor living space. So mechanical ventilation is a core part of the Passive House concept and principles. So you're automatically going to have that high indoor air quality. That's one, yeah. And then another big benefit, obviously, is the topic of comfort. So the building envelope, the thermal enclosure is not only good for our energy savings, it's also really, really important for the thermal comfort, which again has side effects on health. Right? If people feel comfortable, they're not subjected to any drafts, they are healthy. They feel comfortable and they're more healthy, which then has other side effects, such as whether you're in an office environment, productivity, for example. Right? Which then again has benefits in terms of, or has been in some studies interpreted in terms of what are the add-ons in terms of also cost implications. If your people are more productive within your space, what does that mean for the overall company? So the list just keeps on adding on. You start with the concept of energy efficiency, comfort, and health, and then it just trickles on from there.
Exactly. So, Alea, if we take that a step further, there's the inherent benefits of Passive House, right? Just in the approach between the passive and the active systems. But then you get to, we were talking earlier about electrification, but before electrification, there's the idea of renewables and how much more affordable renewables can be by following this process. Maybe comment on the relationship between the Passive House approach and renewables.
So as part of California's policy, we define the loading order. And what that says is kind of similar to what Passive House says, is that you need to look at energy efficiency first before you look at anything else in terms of meeting our energy demands. And so, addressing those loads in the building and bringing those loads down not only can reduce energy use substantially by crushing those heating loads, it can make you more comfortable, of course, and it can let us, ride out heat waves, cold waves, cold spells. It can let us, when the power goes out, I heard some interesting data about how long a Passive House can drift during a power outage and still maintain comfortable interior temperatures. We have more even mean radiant temperatures within the building because of the attention to detail on the envelope and enclosure. So addressing that first, and then we put some really good equipment that doesn't have to be really complicated all the time, especially if we're talking residential homes. It can be pretty simple to now handle that really low load, and then last, slap on the renewable energy to just take over what's left.
And you guys deal with fires. You guys deal with forest fires and all different kinds of fires out there. Again, it goes back to resilience.
Yeah, resilience and the interaction with indoor air quality. There's been a lot of talk of that in California and Colorado with the fires, where we have fires and poor indoor air quality, or outdoor air quality at the same time that we have power outages. And so a home that has this level of resiliency provides so much benefit in those instances.
Yeah, so Paul, take that then a step further. And as we get to the idea of electrification, how important is it in terms of thinking about the grid? So different parts of the country deal with different dirtiness or cleanliness of their grid. How do you think about efficiency in the grid and then electrification?
Well, actually, I was thinking about what Jessica said about productivity. I think I have my new research project, and that's to see is Passive House going to make us so much more productive that we can go to a 4-day work week? So if anyone wants to work on that, let me know. So it's a big question there. I thought maybe this would be a good chance for a shameless pitch. So in this our Commonwealth leadership definitely gets how much all the benefits of Passive House, the whole list. Maybe not the 4-day work week yet, but they're getting there. But there's real interest in resiliency and the efficiency, lower loads, crushing heating, getting off fossil fuels. The list goes on and on. And the mission of the DOER includes codes. So what we wanted to do, we have a code cycle that we were legislated to do that will be finished by December 20, this coming December, and will go into effect in the following summer. We took that as an opportunity to take many of the design elements that is incorporated in Passive House and put that into the broader code. So for example, our proposed code, we will move to a thermal energy demand intensity limit for buildings. That's the way Passive House works. We're moving towards much more robust infiltration requirements and testing, Passive House. We're moving towards energy recovery systems, energy recovery mandates in ventilation, Passive House. And we're also moving to much more robust specifications for thermal bridging, which is really totally bereft in the IECC and ASHRAE codes. So again, that's all inspired by Passive House. We also have in our code an option for towns to opt into, and in that option, it would make Passive House mandatory for multifamily. So we're very excited about that. I think we might be the first state that will have a mandate for Passive House in its code if the city or town chooses this option. So all of that is, the reason for all that is because as when you do the math, what you find is that we have to have our new buildings to be the kind of very small loads that Passive House delivers, and we need to have new buildings to be fully electrified. So that hopefully answers your original question.
Yeah, what we're seeing and hearing, and this came out in some of the webinars from last week, Friday, which were excellent. If you haven't had a chance to listen to the webinars from last week, Friday, they're really terrific. But what came across is the idea that, some developers are pushing back on electrification because the grid doesn't necessarily flow towards that, especially multifamily, where we're working off of tight budgets. We really want to go after this idea of equity, right? Passive House for all. Multifamilies, there should not be fuel poverty in the United States, right? So how do you make fuel much less piece, much lower piece of tenants and their costs? And so what we are hearing is a little bit of pushback on this idea of electrification, depending on what the grid looks like because of cost. And what I think a lot of people are saying is, ergo, that's why you do Passive House. Get your demand so low that it's irrelevant, right? So shout out to all policymakers, like everybody who's pushing on policy. They're doing a great job. I'll comment. Derek Tillman, I think, is here, and he was involved in making sure that the work that you referenced in Pennsylvania, the Pennsylvania Housing Finance Agency, there was a little bit of an assault on Passive House and the elements of Passive House. And we have to be vigilant in protecting our gains too, in as much as making progress. Because if people haven't had, for whatever reason, a great experience, there's tremendous pushback. And Derek was instrumental in making sure that we protected those gains in Pennsylvania. So shout out to all the policymakers and Bronwyn's policy committee that's doing great work, and we'll have to make sure that they keep pushing on EnerFit and existing buildings, because that's the next frontier. Brad, with regard to some of the benefits of that you're seeing at Winthrop Center, one thing that we saw a great amount of reaction to were the acoustic benefits. Are you seeing that being downtown? In Pennsylvania, we have a library, Passive House certified, I think one of the first, if not the first, certified library in the country. And it's downtown, and literally from me to that wall, away from a bus a bus stop, right? And so what was so obvious at the library is how quiet it was. You could stand at the window and watch the buses go by and not hear them. And for a library, that's kind of a big deal. So I'm wondering if you're seeing the same things in that regard.
Absolutely, we're hearing the difference. You know, like a single pane window compared to triple glazed passive house facade is like 50 to 60% noisier, 15 to 20% on the double glazed. And when you go into the space, we're not 100% done. Some terraces, we still have to put the terrace door on, but when you walk around the floor, it is markedly quieter. And 100%, that acoustical benefit, you know, kind of that crossover between healthy and high performance is there.
That's great. Paul, one of the greatest needs from our standpoint as practitioners in this space to drive passive house, new buildings, and maybe even more existing buildings is in schools, particularly K through 12. I don't know how it is here, but in our state and in our city in Pittsburgh, we have terrible schools. There are schools that the buildings are in complete disrepair, and they're perfect candidates for passive house and EnterFit, but it's hard to get traction without the successes and without being able to show that type of improvement. Is some of your legislation, or do you see policy being directed towards schools at this point, or how do you think about your school system?
Yeah, the MSBA in Massachusetts here, that they're the ones that fund schools throughout the state, have been working incredibly hard to try to electrify schools, bring in better ventilation, better outside air, better filtration, like the whole gamut of things. And they're looking at passive house and the elements of passive house as, you know, the way to do it. And they see that when it comes to retrofits, where we have a lot of learning to do. It's just very difficult to know a good, cost-effective approach for some of these very old schools. So we all have a lot of work to do on you know, going back and fixing schools. Everyone is definitely aware when you build a new school, you know, do it right so we don't have another one to retrofit later. So let's try to make that retrofit list as small as possible and not increase that list. So I think everyone's on board there.
Jessica, you want to add to that in terms of what you're seeing?
Yeah, if I could just chip in with a thought. I think we were seeing earlier how important it is that you get inspiration from projects that already exist. And this is a great example of how the international community can really help, because actually schools is one of the typologies that in some countries has really picked up and really driven passive house. So UK is one example where schools is one of the first typologies that was really picked up. They built 1 or 2 schools, it worked out really well. And now in Scotland especially, the new schools coming on board are all being built to passive house standard. And one big driver there, again, is health and air quality. It's just a completely different learning environment. So maybe that's something where we can kind of, since we know that existing projects showing that it can be done help to drive uptake, that's where the international community can come in and say, okay, if it's, I know the local context is being different, but if that typology is being done in other parts of the world, we can translate, we can learn from that and implement it here. And we're starting to also see retrofit projects coming online in Germany for schools. So step by step, but we're
Well, maybe coming out of this, if you have any collateral, any materials, case studies or anything, you might be able to get them to Ken and the team for distribution as part of this, because I think that would be very helpful. And I heard MP Boston wanted to take on a school somewhere.
After this one.
Okay, everybody, so we're kind of winding down on our time. It's been tremendous. You all are just really exceptional and extraordinary in your knowledge and the way you articulate your ideas to the people here and on the webinar. But maybe if we could just take a couple minutes each and just talk to the people who are just showing up for the first time. They've not done this. They don't know if they want to do this. If you were to be able to say anything to your younger self, your less experienced passive house self, you know, what would you want to hear at this stage? And who wants to go first? I'll take a volunteer.
Yeah, sure, I'll take it. So I would say this, trust your instincts, right? Look around you. You see that the world is changing at a pace that none of us in this room have ever seen. So embrace that challenge, and understand that messaging to the stakeholder is key. That's my biggest lesson learned in this whole thing, messaging, right? Healthy, high performance, decarbonization. Don't necessarily lead with what the certification is, right? Because then you end up having to explain what Passive House is applied to office. Start with the messaging, start with what it does, right? Because you know that that's where we're going, that's where the demand is gonna be. And, don't, I would say embrace the challenge straight on, because really it's an opportunity and it's tried and true, like Jessica has said, and it works, and it is the way forward, and it's, like I tell my cohorts, it's the path to zero, right? Energy efficiency, Passive House is the path to zero, which is where we're trying to go.
That's outstanding. Thank you. We'll just go right down the line. Paul, you're next.
That was going to be hard to top. That's really. Before I got deeply into Passive House, I did a lot of work in other energy efficiency stuff, heat pumps, and the mindset for us all, I think, in that era, going back 10 plus years ago, was that energy efficiency, adding renewables was always adding, making things more complicated. And this whole notion, this mindset of like, oh, we're adding something and now it has to pay back. With Passive House, completely changed that equation. Passive House is actually taking things away. It's making things simpler. And then you go from there. And so that's like little pearl of wisdom on Passive House for those that are new to this, is that it makes things easier, simpler, more durable. Like that's maybe a starting point for a conversation for someone new to Passive House.
I like that. It's a very good way to think about it. I think give it a try. I've heard yesterday a handful of examples about staged approaches, that we don't have to dive in head first, especially those of us who are just stepping into this. Start out with something that you're comfortable with and push yourself a little bit, and then take it one step at a time. Let's try and think about all of these themes that we're talking about today. Let's think about them strategically and synergistically, instead of trying to tackle one thing here and another thing there. Let's try to think of these as there's one solution to get to ultimately our end goal.
That's great. So bring us home, Jessica, with your wisdom and thoughts.
No pressure
And
there.
it's got to be brutally honest and fantastic. So with that,
Over to you, Beth. Don't be scared of it. If you're completely new to Passive House, don't be scared. This is the way forward. It is the way it's the future. The path has been paved. It's been around for a long time. There are a lot of solutions available. So there's no need anymore to think about Passive House, high energy efficiency buildings. It's this huge thing somewhere up there, and I don't really know what it is. I don't know how to get there. So if you're new to all of this, I say, don't worry about it being something special, something new, something different. This is the new normal. We've had a lot of experiences being on that learning curve, fighting for change, but I think we're at that stage where it is becoming the new normal. So if you're completely new to this, go to projects that have already existed, learn from those, and then just embrace it. Say, this is what I'm going to do, be confident about it, and go ahead and do it.
yeah, that's great. And I'll add, I was talking earlier today with Maureen Sanchez from RDH, and we were talking about the importance of collaboration, right? Like, this is a community that wants to help. So don't hesitate asking for help. Your website's terrific. Passive House Accelerator is an unbelievable source of knowledge and wisdom. And every practitioner in this community is willing to share their experience and advice. So don't hesitate to ask for help, because it's available out there, and as are all of you available for questions and help, and we're going into a break. So we'll all be available if anybody has any questions. And next up, I think, is a panel on electrification. So they'll click a little bit deeper. One plug again to the webinars from last week. They were exceptional. There is one on electrification in kitchens by Chef Galarza that is fantastic. So if you haven't seen the webinars from last week, please make sure you tune in and listen to some of those. They're terrific. But thank you again. You all were wonderful. And back to you, Ken.